Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartia, and welcome to this special edition of TFR Insights. And today we have with us once again Kroah-Hartman. We are seeing each other after so many. It looks like almost a decade now, right? It's not even a year.
Yeah, it's been a while. It feels like it.
So, Greg, first of all, where are you these days?
I live in The Hague now, in the Netherlands.
How is everything there in this COVID-19 time?
It's all good. We are locked down again, but restaurants are closed, schools are still open, and numbers are going up, but they're plateauing and hopefully come down in a couple of weeks. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, kids are still in school, but no restaurants.
So if you look at where you live, what you do, and if you look at the open source world, even I, ever since I left India and have been living in Germany, I have never worked in a corporate office. I have always worked remotely from home. And if you look at open source, everybody works from. So has there been any impact at all at your work? Not only personally, the way you work, but the whole community, because everybody is already working from basement and home.
Well, personally, no. I mean, I've worked remotely for 16, 17 years now, but I don't travel. So it's nice, but I get to do these talks remotely. Last week, I gave a talk to one major company, I gave a talk at a conference, and I gave a talk to a university all in the same week. Two of them was in one day, and I never would have been able to do that before. So that's fine. But a lot of kernel development happens at companies. So, I mean, a lot of major people, the majority of people work for companies. So they do go into office. That being said, if you look at our last kernel release and this one we're now, and the one before that, there's more development now than ever. Now, whether it's due to the fact that we're all at home and we can actually get work done and not bothered by inappropriate or wasteful meetings, I don't know, but it hasn't slowed us down at all. For the kernel.
Yeah, this is also interesting because you are keeping a track also, as you mentioned, there are so many factors that play a very big role. Also, travel wastes a lot of time. No, I like to travel, but that does take up a lot of time in just going from place X to place Y. Second is that when you work in an office environment, you just have to work. Doesn't matter whether you feel productive or not. When you work on your own time, you want to do the work like it could be middle of the night or whatever it is, But if you are doing 9 to 5, you don't. I mean, it's the office hours are over. Why should you be doing any work?
Yeah, it's hard. It's a hard switch between working from home and not. I mean, in the very beginning, I was very much, I have to work now. Don't bother me. It's not going to work at all. And then after a couple of years, I'd like pop up and talk to my wife, like, "Hey, what are you doing? Want to go get coffee now?" And things like that. So you work and flow. But I mean, like, for example, we're talking here, it's 9 o'clock at night. I just got done with a meeting from somebody else a few minutes ago. So times are strange and time zones are strange talking to people around the world. So I'm used to odd hours, but working from home is great. I can hang out and do stuff during the middle of the day, other stuff. I don't think I could go back to an office if I had a choice. I love it. It works well.
No, I can't do that either. But also, it's a bit of a challenge also because you have to be really a lot disciplined because, as you said, it's 9 p.m. there and you're in Europe, but at 9 p.m. you're sitting at home. I mean, of course, because of lockdown, nobody will be at home in Europe at this time. But how do you kind of manage to maintain the balance between work and personal life, or there is no balance whatsoever?
Again, I've gotten used to it. You just have to carve out the time and say, ideally, if you have a place where you can close the door or something like that. I have an open door to another room, but and your family gets used to it and things like that. As long as you get your work done, that's all that matters. It just takes time to do that. It's hard. Everybody's different instances. My best example is somebody I used to work with a long time ago, that he would wake up in the morning, take a shower, get dressed, walk outside, walk around the block, come in, and then go to work. And that was all right, this is my delimiting, this is my work time, and I'm going to do this. And other people are like, I haven't seen anybody in weeks, I need to go to a coffee shop. So it depends on the person, but it's just all different. It's a different skill set, right? Personally, I really like it. I mean, I really used to be really annoyed at working in an office. I remember specifically one time somebody walked by, interrupted me in my office and knocked on the door and said, "I could go look this up, but since you're here, I'm going to ask you instead." I'm like, no, so much for what I was just working on. So for knowledge-based workers who have to try to get in the zone and work on something and think about it, it's really, really difficult to work in a constantly interruptible place. So if you have a place at home, you can carve out some good time to think and work. That's perfect. It works really well. Maybe that's why we're seeing more kernel patches now. I don't know.
Exactly, yeah, because you can see the impact also. At the same time, it also depends, like, of course, some cities, their apartments are like, single bedroom or whatever it is. So both wife is sitting on her Zoom call on one corner, husband is sitting on Zoom call other corner, and if the meeting is going on,
It doesn't work well, and it's hard with small children and whatnot. I mean, the best was I was in a meeting a while ago, and a little girl ran up and said, "It's an emergency! It's an emergency!" And the guy's like, "Okay, hold on." And then he came back a few minutes, and he said, "The emergency was we were out of ice cream." I mean, it's getting used to it. So I mean, small children, it's really hard. That to be said, I mean, I've been working since my son was 1 at home, and if I'm lucky to have a spouse that could be at home at certain times. She was in graduate school, so we shared times, but then that allowed us to have flexible. She could go do her thing when I could work and trade off and things like that. So it is hard. People are getting used to working from home now. Companies seeing it's changing the way companies work. And it's interesting. For those of us who said you can do this, it's really nice to see that when forced to, you can. And companies are embracing it. And I'm happy about that. And that opens up more opportunities to more people because not everybody that's the smartest person can live in that specific town and work with you. It opens it up to more places in the world and other things. When I worked at SUSE and Novell, we had people on the kernel team that was all around the world, and that was great. And that's where we all worked from. There are ways to work that you can do in a distributed manner that are proven, they're well known. You just have to do it, and you can't differentiate between in the office and outside the office. Nat Freeman at Novell laid down some really good ground rules when we were there, and it works. It can be done. You just have to have management buy-in to do it.
Also, one more thing, because Linux or open source in general has been a very good use case also for remote and distributed working, where you don't have to. And you rightly said, sometimes it's not just that you have to move to a particular region to get that job. Sometimes you want to live in a place, but you cannot because there is no job. But now, because it's crisis, you can go buy a big farm in middle of nowhere in Texas and be working for a Silicon Valley company. You can move to Europe or wherever you want. At the same time, you can also get access to the talent from different, so because this whole mindset that is changing for companies as well, that hey, you don't have to get everybody in the same office. I think that's also I mean, I don't want to give unnecessary credit, or I can give the credit to Linux once again, that you guys set up this model also where people just work remotely and created such a successful project. But companies were not very, but now it is.
Things like email are a very good way of doing development, in that it is demand driven. If when I have time, I can respond to it, and I can take my time and think about it and look at it. And if English is not your native language, your first language, you can translate it and work on it and spit it back out and do something else and go on. So working around the world and working remotely works really, really well with email. When you have event-driven stuff, like you have to be on Slack or IRC or chat, or there's some big open source projects that have online chat meetings. And that's like, oh, that's horrible. You just cut out 2/3 of the world right there because they don't feel comfortable with talking in their native language. And as someone who does not live in the country I live in, that where the native language is not my first language, I definitely am very aware of that. And you want to be accommodating and want to be helpful. And that's one reason I think Linux works really well, because we do have that little bit delayed response. But it's delayed response when you can do that. But that being said, we also do more work than anybody else ever has because of that, because we can scale and because we can pull from the best parts around the world. I don't care where you live or who you are or what you do that way. We're looking at your output, and that's all that matters.
So since you're saying that you're seeing a lot of productivity, so let's talk about the latest kernel.
So we have a stable kernels, which is I maintain Linus's last release until the next one comes out. But then it's hard to build devices on that and rely on that. So people want a stable kernel that can get updates for longer periods of time. So we pick one a year, and it was always odd. And when do we pick it? Do we announce it ahead of time? And over the years, we've been doing this for 15 years now. We picked the last one of the year. So it's just a time-based release. When it gets in there or not, it makes it much easier. And then I'll maintain that for at least 2 years. That being said, if you look at all the other LTS kernels I've been doing, the long-term support, people build devices on them. And when you build a device from a specific SoC or chip manufacturer, it takes about 2 years for a product to come out based on that chip. So that'll be right when I would drop support for it. And that didn't really work. So Google stepped up and sponsored Lenaro to help me out. And through those two groups' work, we now support these for 6 years sometimes. So 5.10, I will support for at least 2 years. Let's see if devices pick it up and start using it. Then we'll make it longer as well, because I don't want to be maintaining something that nobody uses, which is one reason the older kernels like 4.4 and 4.9, I didn't know if I should really support them for a long period of time because people said they were in their devices, but they never updated their devices. So it wasn't, I was creating a kernel that nobody was really using. And it was like, okay, great. It's all secure and every wonderful, but it never got pushed to your phone. So nobody used it. But if you look, the Pixel phones, they all got the 4.4 kernels and they kept up to date. The first Pixel 3.18, I think it's still getting security updates. And that's being maintained by Lennar and Google. So that's what I do. So we maintain those for a long period of time. That being said, I'd only recommend using a 2-year-old kernel in a embedded device that has a specific SoC and a specific type of thing like that. If you're on any servers or especially a desktop, always update to the latest one. There's no reason to use an older one. In fact, it even harms you because in newer kernels, we actually go faster and we have more security features and we have more hardware support and the world changes, so we change the kernel to adapt to that. And if you're stuck with an older kernel, some of those adaptations aren't there yet. So, Case Cook from the security team, infamously, every kernel release, he writes a little summary of here's all the new security features that have been added to the kernel for the new kernel release. Those are never backported to older ones, but if you want a more secure and reliable system, you want those features. So go to a newer kernel. I recommend that.
I'll talk about this going to newer kernel, but I also want to talk about some use cases. Anything interesting that is happening, or you have conquered? There is nothing left to. But if there are new use cases or you are targeting, talk about them.
Infamously, somebody used to always ask me, "Are you done with the kernel yet?" And it took me years to finally come out with it. Even worked at a hardware company. Well, we'll finish when you stop making new chips, right? Basically, all we do is support new hardware devices, right? That's the job of a kernel, is to abstract the hardware away and make it look like a uniform system. So yeah, so we're supporting more chips, more devices. That being said, I don't know if there's any major new features. Look on the Kernel Newbies website. They have a list of every kernel release, and they have the major features and the major things that have been added. I recommend that. 5.10, I don't think there's anything off the top of my head, but there's been tons and tons of changes in there. 5.9 got some more locking improvements and some more scalability improvements. 5.10 has some more scalability improvements, hopefully. So we are going faster on newer kernels, which is interesting to see. I got one patch that sped up one benchmark by 30%. And we're like, what? How did that happen? So sometimes there's some low-lying fruit out there that accidentally we pick up, and that's great. So the best thing is just use whatever your hardware supports, right? So the newest kernel will always support the most amount of hardware. So update to that. We see like brand new laptops. I got a patch saying, somebody, will you blackport this device to this really old kernel for this new laptop? I'm like, you bought a laptop with new hardware that was made in this past year and you want to backport it to a 3-year-old kernel. We can't go back in time, so why would you want to even do that? Right? Just use the latest stuff. There's no reason why you shouldn't be using the latest stuff, because we made the guarantee we're not going to ever break user space. We always want you to feel comfortable with updating to the latest kernel. And we made that guarantee, 12, 14 years ago. And we've kept it. And we don't break user space in ways that you notice. Sometimes we have to break things, and if you ever notice, then we'll fix it. But we don't break it on purpose. And that's one really interesting thing I get talking to people over the years. They're like, Linux is boring. It's the old Unix model. What are you guys still doing this? Haven't we come up with something new? It's like, yeah, it is old and boring because it runs those old and boring binaries from 25 years ago. Your old Unix programs still work because we remain compatible. But if you look at all the past work that's done in the past 5 years, we have almost like a microkernel in there with eBPF. We have fast IO with IOU ring, and we have all these other amazing features with containers and namespaces and all this fancy stuff that you can do even more interesting and crazy things that you can't, that is not like the old Unix model. So we're doing more. We've evolved a lot, but yet it isn't obvious when you try and look at the old model, because the old model was still there as well. And we've kept that compatibility. And that's important because you want to keep things still running. People still have to run Oracle somewhere, right?
Yeah. But I'm also curious about some new use cases or usage where you see now Linux has been used there as well. I mean, of course, I think that's what I was saying. It's almost everywhere, but still, I mean, edge computing is growing, so a lot of things are moving to the edge.
I don't know where it is.
It's not running. Yeah.
I don't know where it is, and that's really a hard thing. Somebody was like, oh, it doesn't work on low memory devices. And I just saw, there's the infamous, somebody made a business card that runs Linux for under $5. That's in like 1.2 meg. So there's Linux running there. Cow milking machines, International Space Station, air traffic control, all the stock markets. At my level, we don't see the use cases very often. we see problems saying, hey, this workload over here seems to crash, or my device over here doesn't work, but I don't know what they're doing with it, which is fine. We're creating a tool that people can solve their problems with. Kernel isn't sexy or flashy or anything. We just want to make you a solid base that you can provide. You can go do something to solve your problem. Nobody's forcing you to use Linux, but hopefully you do use it because it helps solve your problem for you, which is our goal.
And boring is actually good. Boring is good because things, when things are stable, that's when things become boring, and that is a good indicator as well.
Yeah, we've always been boring. I mean, we're just a rock solid thing that just works. And that's important because you want something that just works, right? And that's also actually a really, really hard engineering problem to solve, is to create something boring and stable that just works over time. I mean, we have made something that's just worked for a really long period of time to handle everybody's use case. That's something very, very difficult to do, and made it stable and kept it up to date and maintained it at a huge rate of change at the same time. I mean, everything's being replaced and modified and updated and changed, and yet we still keep everything working as it goes, which is an amazing engineering feat. It's great that people are writing papers and doing good studies on software engineering best practices, finally realize this. But we did something interesting and something different that nobody has done before that way, which is fun. For me as an engineer, it's fun. I like that because this is a hard engineering problem.
It is. It is. One thing that I do feel is that RTOS, real-time operating systems, where Zephyr is kind of becoming popular. I asked that question last time also. So how seriously are you looking at the RTOS market? And you're like, hey, that's not a space that Linux. And once again, you don't care about the space, right? You just care about the kernel people use it. But still, what do you think about RTOS?
I mean, Linux is an RTOS, right? We are a real-time operating system. And real-time operating system is deterministic. We always hit the things. I mean, Linux has been that way for 15 years. There's laser welding robots, there's John Deere self-driving tractors. Those are all running Linux. Zephyr's there and is an RTOS as well, but it's for the very, very tiny embedded market, under a megabyte, 500K, even smaller, stuff like that. And that's great. And there's a huge market for that. I mean, embedded devices, embedded Bluetooth devices. There's going to be some crossover where it's hard to make hardware that Linux doesn't run on, but for right now, there is that space, and Zephyr fills that really well. And I recommend it. It's a great operating system. It works really well for that. It's totally separate. People who are looking at Zephyr are not looking at Linux. People who are looking at Linux are not looking at Zephyr. Totally different use cases, which is great because Zephyr filled a real hole in the weird RTOS tiny embedded space that wasn't being addressed well by an open source operating system, which is great.
Now I want to come back to the question of security, because even today we still talk about companies are still running old kernels, and now we talk about CI/CD pipelines where things are going. It becomes a really serious topic when it comes to security, because even if you look at most of the hacks are not about exploiting some zero-day vulnerability. It's more about there has been a vulnerability for 2 years, you did not patch it, the patch was there, you did not push it. So is there any mechanism that can be built to push this? When we talk about modern Kubernetes or cloud native workloads, everything is part of CI/CD pipeline. Is that in your consideration? Because you have been advocating, you have been telling companies to do that. Companies like Google can afford to do that, but not everybody.
Well, Google's actually pushing it. So, I mean, look at Android. Android, was it 4 to 5 billion devices running Linux? The Linux running servers is a rounding error, right? So, and all the rest of Linux is a rounding error. So ensuring that those are secure is really important. So Google, I've been working with Google for a number of years to make it so that these stable updates go out and they're tested really well and they're ensured that they're going to work well, and they push them out. And now Google's mandating it. They have the numbers for the past year to back up that we fix bugs before anybody realizes they're bugs. And we also, for security issues, and we also fix bugs that are just bugs. So they're both good to get, right? You want the fixes. I mean, Google said that we fixed 300 and some security bugs before they even knew about it. And we fixed 900 and some bugs in their phone that were just bugs that would have been nice to have fixed. Why wouldn't they pick them up? So they did. So they're going to start mandate this and roll it out and push it. Google's had the ability to flip between a good and bad kernel, Chrome OS and Android phones for a decade, I think, right? So they're pushing it out to everybody, and they need to do that. They mandate it with their security updates. Wonderful, it's good. Other systems should be doing that. I mean, CoreOS took that same model and did it for servers. And so that you can push updates really fast. You have your upper stuff still running, and it works wonderful. Amazon's doing the same thing as well. Google Compute Engine, I think, is probably doing the same thing. I'm not sure what they're doing there, but you can do this. You can do this in an easy way. The old model of you have a monolithic server and you never want to reboot the thing is scary and broken, right? I don't think that really works. You can migrate you can now migrate user space programs across to another virtual machine. You can freeze them, update the operating system, and resume it without even knowing what was going on. There's tons and tons of ways to solve this problem. The problem's been solved. It's just getting people to do it, and that's the trick. And it's hard to get people to do it. I encourage people to take those updates, test them, of course, to make sure that they work, and then push them out to your devices. I talked to one manufacturer in Germany, or no, in France, at the last Embedded Linux conference that we had in person, and we're talking about long-term support for devices. And they're saying, oh yeah, we have a device, we're making it, and we're going to support it for 15 years. I was like, oh, we can't support one kernel version for 15 years. They're like, no. It's okay. This is a device. We're going to update the kernel every year. And because it's a live, living, supported device, we're going to push updates out to as needed. And then maybe at the end of those 15 years, maybe the last year, we won't care so much because it's out of life and whatnot. And that's happening. And there's actually air conditioning units out there running really old, tiny ARM chips, 32-bit ARM chips running Linux that are supported in the mainline kernel today because they're being pushed updates out there into your air conditioning unit on these big commercial systems. That's the important way to do it. It can be done. It just has to be done. So customers have to mandate it. If you look, the US government came out with a list of best practices that they're going to require. And one of the requirements is that you have to have updates, and you have to be able to update it, and you have to push it out there. Your firmware has to be updatable. The EU just announced their requirements for software a couple weeks ago. One of those things is security scanning and updating. They need to be able to update the software that they're getting in these devices. That's the only way manufacturers are going to change, is if it's a requirement, because it does cost them money and time, but you as somebody who's relying on this device should require it, because the world changes and more things come about. You can't just put a box in the corner and never touch it again, unless that box never touches the world. If it never touches the world, fine, that's wonderful. So there's some use cases that are like that. Giant supercomputers, no access, wonderful. We're going to run a problem on it for a couple of years. Great. But the rest of us, you interact with the world changes. You also have to update and change that software. If your operating system does not change and update, it's dead. It's as simple as that.
I mean, let's not talk about the big company like Google, Amazon, who have resources. As we talked about, that it's in almost every device out there, especially in the edge space. Do you see any trends where companies are taking security? Because now the problem is not just updating, the problem is security. Are they taking security seriously, and they are making efforts to make these edge devices like more secure by pushing, patches in time or using the latest kernel? What I want to understand from you is, what are the trends that you're seeing? Do you see any positive change?
Yes. I see a lot more people doing it. I see a lot of people acknowledging that they should be doing it, and then realizing and actually doing it. You'll see the big setback for phones was they said, oh, the carriers will never accept change. You can never change it because the carriers said, no, we're not doing it. When I finally said, who'd you talk to? I drilled down, and we actually went and talked to the big major US carriers. And they said, no, of course we want this. We've been wanting this for years. Why haven't you talked to us? So it's just getting through that mindset of, again, it's not the old mindset of anything that changes is bad. We change stuff on purpose. We are fixing 35 fixes a day. They're there for a reason. We're testing them in unison. You cannot just cherry pick little pieces. Take the whole thing, away you go, and test it and make sure it's there. That's what we say. We've proven that it works. We have a 15-year track record. You can look at our history. I get researchers asking, oh, how do you do this stuff? I'm like, I have these questions about it. I'm like, look, 15 years worth of data, go mine it. And they are. And they're writing research papers about it, which is good. We have a track record. We know how to do this stuff. You just have to update your devices. And there's solutions on how to update your devices. Just take them. They're all open source as well. Please do that.
But this is kind of interesting question, and off the topic question is that now earlier when Microsoft decided to support Linux through WSL, they initially said, no, we will not be shipping the kernel. Kernel, is part of Canonical and all those. Now Windows is shipping kernel itself. So Windows has kind of become a distribution of Linux. Do you consider it a distribution of Linux? Number one. Number two is that, which also means that Linux is now running on 98% of consumer desktops, right? Which is more or less like another victory of Linux. All the jokes apart, what contribution do you see WSL is going to play in making this Linux technologies, tools, languages more accessible to developers who earlier had to either do the VM thingy or had to do dual boot to be able to use Linux on their machines?
I think you answered it. It's going to work. I mean, they created this because their customers were wanting it. They don't create things just for fun. They wanted a way that people could still use Windows and develop for their Linux servers or develop for their Linux embedded systems in an easy way. They tried to emulate the Linux kernel by reverse engineering or clean rooming some of it, and just didn't work. They would never keep up. So they're actually using Linux on there. And it is like a virtual machine in a way, but it's a very well integrated virtual machine. It's a really cool technological hack. I love it. It works wonderful. So yes, now Linux is on the desktop, but Linux has been the number one selling laptop, number 1 through 5 selling laptop for the past 10 years with Chromebooks. So it's not like Linux hasn't been on the desktop before anyway. It just people don't know, and that's fine. But yeah, more exposure, great. It solves their problem, wonderful. I'm very happy to see that. And to be fair, the Microsoft Linux people know what they're doing. They're longtime Unix and Linux engineers. The person in front of runs the team I used to work with at Novell, and he came from AT&T, Unix team. So these people know this stuff. They know this stuff really well. They know the open source community. There's lots and lots of open source community people that work for them, and they contribute back really well. It's a win. But I mean, Microsoft's been contributing to Linux for a decade now, at least. So this is nothing new. Hyper-V's runs Linux really, really well. So much so that now I think Microsoft said, aren't they, over half of all Azure is running Linux, which is great. I mean, Microsoft is, again, just wants to provide a tool for their customers to solve their problems. If Linux happens to solve their problem wonderfully, I'm happy. Great.
Right. Also, when you talk about people, and of course, I don't want to go there, but people criticize. But the fact is that all these people, whether they work for Microsoft, Oracle, or Google, or Amazon, they are working for their company on the very project that they like, which is Linux. So so it's not like their priorities or their loyalties shift. No, they love working on Linux. It doesn't matter which company they work for. So all those people who are working on Linux in Microsoft, they are Linux experts. They are more dedicated and committed to Linux kernel than a lot of other people out there.
It's great. And I always said, I mean, I've said it to you before, everybody contributes to Linux in a selfish way. They want to solve their problem. So Microsoft has problems they want to solve. They have their engineers solve that for them. Wonderful. That's the way it's always been. It just happens that everybody's problems are the same. So it solves the problems for other people as well. And it's cheaper and faster to contribute to Linux upstream to solve your problem. It just has been proven time and time again that way. So they know what they're doing. They're saving money. They're doing it the right way. It's great.
No, I really love when you talk about selfish, and I always tell people, because when you're doing it out of charity, or or you're donating, when you either run out of resources or when you don't feel that altruistic, you stop supporting the project or whatever it is, start pulling funding. But when your own success is tied to the success of that project, when it is selfish, you will continue to be involved. So I think that is a much more sustainable model to get involved with open source than saying, hey, you know what, we are just donating, contributing out of charity. No, that model will not work.
Well, yeah. And I mean, I will say I have an ulterior motive here. If I get you to contribute, because it does save time and money for you, you now are invested. So I'm selfishly making you reliant on the whole ecosystem to be there, and you're sustaining it and growing it by working together. That's what I've been doing for the past decade, is going around and getting companies involved, not saying, I'll just take your code, or what I will help your engineers become part of our community, because that's the way we grow, that's the way we survive and thrive, and that's the way we solve more problems, because you know your problems that your customers have in your workloads better than anybody. So solve those problems, and that makes Linux work better for you, and it solves it for everybody else. The community grows bigger, Linux sustains, and it's a feedback loop. I'm doing that in a purely selfish way because I want to see Linux succeed, but it turns out that's in selfish way for you as well. So it's a good feedback loop there, a little symbiosis.
Yeah, it's mutual selfishness, which is good. There's one area that Linux is still not there, and since I'm heavily into it, which is VR, all the platforms that I look at, why is that so? Because VR is a very ideal use case, because you can get the full performance, you get, embedded into the device itself. Why is it not there?
So I don't know, but I mean, Oculus runs Linux. I mean, these common VR headsets are running Linux inside them. Valve's work on VR for, I don't know, it's been a decade maybe, has all been on Linux to get those things working. Yes, they work on Windows because the Windows gaming systems are huge, and that's a big market. Sony does their stuff using BSD, right? So that's Sony's decision. But there is a lot of work. I do know a number of Linux kernel people now working for Valve on something. So I don't know what they're doing, but Linux is in that VR device. Whether you can plug it into your Linux box or not, I don't know. I'm not quite sure about that. I know Linus has some, and he plays VR using his Linux box.
Yeah, I think the question I should have been asking was the desktop. But when you look at Linux as a desktop, there are a lot of areas where it's not very strong.
Why does anybody care? If a company actually cares. So I worked for Novell for a while, and we made money selling Linux pre-installed on hardware. So it can be done if the hardware company wants to do it, right? It's up to them. If that's the market they want to go after, it can be done. Chromebooks selling Linux, exceedingly huge market. They're doing really, really well on the desktop, on the laptop. So it can be done if you want to do it. If nobody else wants to do it, all HP business laptops ship with Linux. So all these workstations that go for all the graphic design, that's all running Linux. Do you want to go after the really tiny desktop market for the consumer space? I don't know. I'd rather go for the 5 billion Android devices. I mean, what do you say? But that's, again, a business decision. Hopefully, I've used Linux as a desktop for 20 years. It can be done if you want to do it. It's up to you if you want to do it or not. So Canonical was trying to do that for a while. Good for them. I've gotten Dell laptops with Canonical pre-installed. Wonderful job.
Yeah, so let's talk about this a bit. This has been a topic that we have resurfaced a couple of times. That is about you have a lot of contributors, so you don't really have to worry about contribution. We have talked about diversity earlier. These days, becoming even more important topic. So, are there any efforts from within the Linux community, because you guys are not controlled by a company, to make it? It is welcoming community. People who see it from inside, they do know how welcoming it is. Of course, a lot of people from outside, a lot of news cycle, that is just BS, so let's not go there. But realistically, are you worried about either diversity, or you're like, hey, we should make effort so as not only to have more maintainers per at the same time have a diverse contributor base as well?
Yes, I fully believe you need a diverse group of background of all developers, everybody from all wakes, makes, models, sex, races. We need that because everybody brings a different model to the table, and that we want it to work for everybody. So I fully embrace that. That being said, the Linux Foundation, we have a huge diversity program. We have a huge intern program. I just had 8 interns this summer. From a diversity and minority backgrounds, fixed tons and tons of security bugs in the kernel. It just ended today. So 8 developers from all around the world did really, really good stuff. I think slowly there'll be some some blog posts about what they did, but I'll just call a few out. One developer fixed major security bugs in the kernel that was found. Another developers, some of them fixed tons of little tiny security bugs all over the place. One of them ended up becoming a maintainer of a subsystem. Didn't even realize it. But so these are people who are getting involved, and now they're looking and they're going and they're saying, how do I do this as a full-time job? Some are just going back to school and wanting to continue their programs at school and then go off and do more Linux work after they graduate. But no, so Linux Foundation's been pushing hard. That being said, the number of minorities and females that are members of the kernel community is actually above average. We're not good by any means, but we are far above average from other open source projects. I know we looked at the Python versus the kernel numbers. I think it was in that document that just came out. We are like double the number of Python. Now that's a very tiny number, but we do have it there. It of course needs to get better. I can only say that. But then getting things better also goes back to your environment, and we need to get better education and more pipelines for getting people up, because there is a high barrier to do this work. It is a very technical job, and we need to provide resources for everybody to be able to do this type of work. So I fully embrace that, and we've been working hard at Linux Foundation. I will say I think Intel donated a bunch of money to sponsor all this because our interns all get paid. So they work well. It's like the Outreachy and the Google Summer of Code stuff. The internship program we do is a little better because it isn't as fixed of timeline for Outreachy, so we can stagger it and work around people's school schedule or work around people's work schedule. Some of the people that were interns actually had a job at the same time. They just were working on an intern as a half-time job, and it worked out really well because they were doing it in Asia, or they're doing it in other countries where they could work on the time zone, and it worked out better. So yeah, I will recommend nobody ever having 8 interns at once. So it's a lot of work for me, but it was very rewarding. They did a lot of really good work.
And since you mentioned Intel. There was a 1 millionth code committed to Linux kernel. He was Ricardo Neri. He's from Mexico, and I interviewed him also. And he actually brought this up as well. And what he said was that open source lowers the barrier to entry because you don't have to prove yourself whether you can do it or not. It doesn't matter where you are. You look at the code, you think something, and you contribute it. So, whether it's you or whoever it is, you don't actually ask them, hey, do you have a computer science degree or not? Do you understand the system? You see the code. So he was like, it has enabled a lot of people to become technologists because they can play with themselves, they can download the code. So it has contributed a lot to lowering the barrier of entry for a lot of these minority groups as well, or underrepresented minority, at least depending on the country. In their country they are majority, but in this, so it does play. It has done. It's just that it doesn't come out. And then you're also right about kernel is a very technical topic. It's not very easy where anybody can just climb up all the way there. So it does, but whatever efforts are going on there, they are commendable. Now, before we wrap this up, what I do want to know, and I'm sure people are also curious about, is number one is, what is the operating system you're using these days? Is it Gentoo or Arch Linux or SUSE Tumbleweed? And what DE you use?
I use Arch, and I've been using it for a while. I actually did a little welcome to the Arch Linux conference introduction that happened a couple weeks ago, which is good. And I use GNOME. So GNOME in that way. I'm going to be speaking at the Application Summit, which is the GNOME and KDE developers conference together in a couple weeks, which is good. Again, it's remote, so I can give a talk remotely. But the GNOME and the KDE guys both make great work. I've used other ones in the past, but GNOME works well for me, so I'm happy.
Yeah, I also GNOME. It simplifies things for an average user. KDE's beauty is that I want just too many functionalities sometime in my file manager, and KDE is like Plasma is like an onion. The more you peel, the more layers you'll get. So both have there's nothing, no DE is perfect for a user. It depends on what your use case is, what you want. The beauty is that you can choose whichever desktop environment fits for your workflow. So most cases I like GNOME because simple and easy, and in most cases I prefer Plasma because I can customize it to my workflow and all those things. So I think now we can wrap this up, right, Greg? Anything? Greg, thank you so much for talking to me after such a long time. I wish we could have done it in person, but I'm happy that we can do it remotely. And the beauty is that most of the technologies we are using to do it are powered by Linux and open source.
Yes, the whole network is. Yes, that's great. All right, thank you.